Hello students, welcome to the IIT PAL series of biology. I am Rikisha Bhaumik, PGT Biology at Kendriya Vidyalaya Sector 2, RK Puram. Before beginning our session today, if I ask you a question, what is the most unique thing about our planet Earth? You most probably would say that the presence of life is what makes Earth unique. Next, if I ask you, what is the most amazing thing about life on Earth? After seeing these photographs, you would surely say that the diversity in living organisms is the most amazing thing about life on Earth. In our life, whenever we go anywhere on roadside or in a garden, we see so many different types of plants, trees, herbs, shrubs, climbers, creepers. Even among ourselves, if we see each other, we all differ from each other, except obviously the identical twins. So, the enormous diversity in living organism is the most amazing thing about life on Earth. In today's session, we will be exploring more about biodiversity and its importance and its conservation in our chapter Biodiversity and Conservation, class 12th. So, this is the part 1, session 1 of Biodiversity and Conservation. This chapter will give you insights on questions such as, why are there so many species? Did such great diversity exist throughout Earth's history? How did this diversification come about? These questions, if you recall, we did the sessions on evolution and we have discussed these questions there. There are so many species, if you recall that evolution or the process of speciation and natural selection gives us an insight on the great diversity which has come about. The process of speciation led to the formation of many species, and today whatever biodiversity has accumulated is due to a long process which took millions of years. How and why is this diversity important to the biosphere? Would it function any differently if the diversity was much less? These last two questions we will deliberate upon these sessions on biodiversity and conservation. So, you will get a rough idea or a precise idea from general to specific about what is biodiversity, how it got accumulated, what is its importance and why should we conserve it, and if we need to conserve it, what should we do to conserve it. With this, the last question which arises, because we humans are always thinking about ourselves, how this biodiversity is important for us, how will it benefit us. So, we will also look into these aspects of how humans can benefit from the diversity of life. As I have told you that biodiversity refers to the variety or variations, variability. Variability refers to the tendency to show variations of living organisms present on Earth. This may also be referred to as biological diversity. Biological diversity. The living organisms comprises biological, and the differences, the variety, variations, variability among these living organisms can be referred to as biological diversity. And actually these two terms, biological and diversity, they got compressed to form this one term, biodiversity, and all this happened in 1980s. This term biodiversity was coined by Walter G. Rosen, but it was popularized by a famous sociobiologist named Edward Wilson. Let us have a brief summary of what I told you. Biodiversity is the variety and variability of different types of lives found on the earth and the variation within species. The term biodiversity was coined by Walter G. Rosen, but it was popularized by a famous sociobiologist Edward Wilson in 1980s. So, the term biodiversity or this subject has gained importance lately in 1980s. Can you guess why is it so? You are correct. This is because the impact of human activities or the anthropogenic activities on the environment has become quite apparent, and that is why there is so much focus on biodiversity these days. Now, the next thing which amazes us that we have discovered and described many species. Anyone would be awestruck to notice that there are more than 20,000 species of ants, more than 3 lakh species of beetles, more than 28,000 species of fishes, more than 20,000 species of orchids, more than 2,81,621 species of vascular plants, and more than 9,990 species of birds. And these are the estimates of only those species which have been recorded and described. There are so many species yet to be discovered. You will be again astonished to know that 80% of the species are yet to be explored and described. Indeed, this diversity is amazing, and it is a constant effort of humans to know more and more about these species. Next, coming to the levels of biodiversity. Biodiversity is actually a composite term. Biodiversity is actually a composite term and includes in its domain major 3 types of diversity. This biodiversity is actually ranges from the molecular level to the biome level, but the 3 major levels of biodiversity can be identified as number 1, genetic diversity, number 2, species diversity, and number 3 is ecological diversity. So, biodiversity is a composite, or it comprises of all these 3 types of diversity. All these 3 types of diversity, genetic, species and ecological biodiversity, are interdependent and intertwined with each other to comprise the biodiversity of this earth. Now, let us try to understand each of these diversity in detail. Starting with the first one, which is the genetic diversity. Genetic diversity, as the name suggests, is the diversity in the genes or the variation in the gene or the genetic composition of an organism can be referred to as genetic diversity. So, what is a gene? A gene can be referred to as a functional segment of DNA. DNA is the hereditary substance. The full form of DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. And what is actually DNA? DNA is again made up of polynucleotide chains. Polynucleotide chains, and the double helical model of DNA which we draw is like this. These 2 strands are the polynucleotide strands. These polynucleotide again are comprised of the nitrogenous bases. These bases are complementary to each other. There is complementary base pairing between the 2 polynucleotide strands. In DNA, we know that there are 4 types of nitrogenous bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine and thymine. So, the alteration in the sequence of these bases, is what causes variation, and this kind of variation is known as genetic variation. So, genetic diversity arises because of certain changes or alteration in the sequence of these nitrogenous bases basically. Now, What is the importance of this genetic diversity? More is the genetic diversity, it has been seen that more is the chance of that particular population to flourish. In other words, it can be said that if a population of a species comprises of different types of genes, they will be in a better position to cope up with the changing environmental situations. So, genetic diversity is a very important level which is helping in maintaining the ecological diversity and the species diversity. For examples, if we take the example of a medicinal plant Rauwolfia vomitoria, many different varieties of this particular medicinal plant can be seen in the Himalayas, but the difference in these varieties is based on the potency and concentration of its active chemical or alkaloid named reserpine. The level and the concentration, the toxicity or potency of this compound varies in different types of Rauwolfia vomitoria. Similarly, we take some common example like that of rice and mangoes, we find that there are so many different types of rice available in the market. Whenever there is the season of mangoes, we find that there are so many different type of mangoes on the basis of its shape, size and the content or the quality of the food or the taste of mango, they have been named differently because they represent different varieties. So, basically this is what is genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is seen within a species when there are different types of genes within the population of a species, it is referred to as genetic diversity. Next, coming to the species diversity. Now, what is species diversity? Again, before discussing about species diversity, we should be able to define what do we mean by a species. Species diversity. Species is a group of morphologically similar organisms, and the most important thing in this is that they should be able to interbreed and perpetuate their population. Should be able to interbreed, they should be able to reproduce and should be able to increase its population. So, when we talk about species diversity, actually we are connoting towards the diversity of species level within a particular region. Now, if we talk about animals, we know that animals can be divided into invertebrates and vertebrates. Again, these vertebrates can have further 5 subgroups. These are Pisces, Amphibia, Reptilia, Aves and mammals. So, by species diversity, I mean to say that within each subgroup there are so many different type of species. If we take for example Pisces, there are so many different types of fishes. Among amphibians, there are so many different species of amphibia. Likewise, in reptiles, aves and mammals, we know of so many different type of species representing that particular group. So, what is basically species diversity? Now, for example, if I take amphibia and compare two regions like Western Ghat and Eastern Ghats of India, we see that there are more number of species of amphibia in Western Ghat as compared to Eastern Ghat. So, we can say that Western Ghat shows more species diversity than Eastern Ghat. So, this is what is species diversity, the diversity at species level within a particular region. Now, moving on to ecological diversity. We are moving from lower towards the broader type of diversity. First we discussed genetic, then species, and now moving on to ecological diversity. So, ecological diversity will cover the entire diversity of a region, of a country or even the globe. So, it is the variation in the ecosystem found in a region or the variation in ecosystems over the whole planet. For example, if we are considering two different countries, for example, one is India, which is subtropical, and the other Scandinavian countries like Norway, Scotland and Iceland, we find that there are more number of biomes in India. We can see deserts, forests, hills, mangroves, coral reefs, wetlands, estuaries, etc. So, it has greater ecosystem biodiversity as compared to the Scandinavian countries. So, this was all about the levels of biodiversity. Next, moving on to the number of species on earth. Can you actually estimate the total number of species on earth? No, it is disappointing to realize that we haven't been able to discover and describe about 80% of the species on earth. But all these species which we have described and discovered have been recorded, and this record is kept by International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. So, according to the IUCN statistics of 2004, there are slightly more than 1.5 million animal and plant species on earth. But as I told you that we still do not have accurate data, as many species are yet to be discovered and described. And many estimates of how many total number of species are there on earth are actually only educated guesses, and these educated guesses vary widely from 3 million to 100 million. So, in this scenario, we follow a more logical, precise and scientific estimate given by a scientist, Robert May. According to his estimate, there are approximately 7 to 8 million of total species on earth. The next thing which interests us is that tropics are more biodiverse than temperate areas. When we reveal the species inventory, we saw that tropics show more biodiversity as compared to the temperate areas. The species inventories therefore are more complete in the temperate as compared to the tropical countries. Because of the large number of biodiversity present in the tropics, it has not been possible to complete the inventory of the tropical areas, but more so we have a complete inventory of the temperate areas. And the most exhaustively studied taxonomic group is that of insects. And keeping that as a standard, biologists make a statistical comparison of the temperate tropical species richness of insects and extrapolate or extend this estimate to other groups of animals to come up with a gross estimate of all the animals. Since it is not possible to physically count each and every organism, each and every species. So, biologists prefer to use this extrapolation method to estimate the number of species present in respective groups. Next, coming to the global biodiversity, the species inventory have revealed certain interesting aspects about the global biodiversity. Global biodiversity when we are referring to the earth as entire. So, 70% of the recorded species are that of animals and only 22% of the plants, and these plant includes fungi, algae, thallophytes, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms. Every group is included in this. So, only 22% of the plants have been recorded till now and 70% of the species. Among animals also, insects are the most species rich and it is about 70% of the total. So, it can be said that of 10 animals, 7 are insect. Out of 10 animals, 7 will be insects. Then fungal species in the world are more than the combined total of species of fishes, amphibians, reptiles and mammals. Again, more number of fungal species have been recorded. So, we can understand this with the help of these pie charts. This pie chart show you about the total number of invertebrates which have been described and recorded. We have been successful in describing more number of insects. 70% of this graph shows insects, followed by other animal groups, mollusks and crustaceans. Similarly, among vertebrates, fishes have been recorded more, followed by birds, reptiles, amphibians and mammals. Among plants, fungi and angiosperms are the most recorded species, followed by algae, mosses, lichens, ferns and allies. So, this was about plants and animals. But what about the prokaryotes? So, what about prokaryotes? What about the estimate of prokaryotes? Surprisingly, we still do not have estimates for prokaryotes. And why is it so? The reasons being, number one, conventional taxonomic methods are not suitable for identifying microbial species. By conventional taxonomic methods, again, we mean doing field studies, going and exploring the different types of organisms and recording them, which is not possible in case of microbial species because they are very minute and cannot be observed by naked eyes. Secondly, many of these species are not at all culturable under laboratory conditions. They cannot be cultured. They have genomes, and the study of these genomes have explored a new branch of biology which is known as metagenomics. Thirdly, if we apply the biochemical or molecular criteria, it will give their estimates in millions, because it will show so many variations, genetic variations, and they have the ability to mutate at a faster rate. So, it is very difficult to give a proper estimate for prokaryotes. Next, moving on from global biodiversity, let us look into the biodiversity of India. Fortunately, India is among the 17 mega diverse countries of the world. With only 2.4% of the world's land area, it shares 8.1% of the global species diversity, which is indeed impressive. So, there are about 45,000 species of plants and 90,000 species of animals in India, which has been recorded and described. But if we go by May's estimate, this diversity may go up to 1 lakh species of plants and 3 lakh species of animals. In this map of India, you can see the Himalayas losing green cover. So, it is very important for us to preserve this biodiversity. Our country is rich in biodiversity. More biodiversity means more amount of resources available for us, and if we are losing it, we are losing a vast amount of resources. Next, I would like to quote one of the statements given by Albert Einstein regarding biodiversity. If the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would only have 4 years of life left. No more bees, no more pollination, no more plants, no more animals, so no more man. To a certain extent, this statement is quite apt. But if we replace bees with pollinators, and pollinators are no more there, if these pollinators become extinct, they are doing such a big ecosystem service for us. They are doing pollination and helping in fertilization and growing of new plants. If there are no more pollinators, there will be no more pollination, no more plants, no more animals, and the survival of human will be in danger. With this, let us move on to our next topic, that is, how much of the species are we losing? Now, you know that this era is dominated by humans, and humans are exerting extreme influence over the environment. We are witnessing rapid loss of species today. This has been estimated to be between 1000 and 1000 times higher than the natural extinction rates. It is not so that the extinction has not been there. It is a natural process. There has been many episodes of extinction. There has actually been 5 extinction episodes in the nature, but their pace was not as fast as it is today. If this loss continues at this pace, we could lose all our natural wealth in just less than 2 centuries. So, again I would reiterate here that the biodiversity which we see is actually an accumulation of a very long process which took millions of years, and losing it just in 2 centuries will be very disheartening. And this may be regarded as a 6th extinction crisis. And this 6th extinction crisis is being guided by the anthropogenic activities. So, the question which strikes our mind is that would we ever be able to complete the inventory of the biological wealth of our country or of the world? To answer this question, we would look into certain facts that we need a lot of time to actually complete the inventory. Apart from time, we need skilled manpower in form of taxonomists who can do this thing properly. But given other fact that we are losing this species at an extremely high rate, this becomes quite hopeless. We can be disappointed or hopeless to realize that it is very difficult actually for us to complete the inventory of the biological wealth of our country. So, nature's biological library is burning even before we catalogue the titles of all the books stocked there. It is a matter of dismay that there are so many species present on earth. Human, who is so inquisitive and curious by nature, wants to discover and explore about all the organisms. Without being acknowledged, these species are getting extinct, and this is the major grave concern for all of us. Now, moving on to the patterns of biodiversity. Is there any pattern of biodiversity or is it random? No, it is not random. There is a pattern of biodiversity. If we look on the earth, we see that as we move away from the equator, biodiversity decreases. This is known as latitudinal gradient. Latitudinal gradient, the latitudes, which are the imaginary lines, have been formed on earth so that we can locate a place properly on it. When we move away from the equator, we see that more number of species are present on those countries which are closer to equator as compared to those which are away from the equator. For example, Colombia, which is located near the equator, has about 1400 species of birds. If we move a little away from the equator, in New York, which is at 41 degrees north, has 105 species, and if we move further above towards Greenland, which is at 71 degree north, it has only 56 species of birds. So, we are seeing a trend, a gradual decline in the number of species of birds from those countries which are closely located to equators towards those which are away from it. So, there is a latitudinal gradient which is seen in the pattern of biodiversity. Some areas are extremely rich in biodiversity. The most biodiverse region of our earth is the Amazon forest, located near the tropics in South America. The Amazonian rainforests are called the lungs of earth because of the huge biodiversity and plants it harbor. It is home to more than 40,000 species of plants, 3,000 species of fishes, 1,300 of birds, 427 of mammals, 427 of amphibians, 378 of reptiles, and of more than 1,25,000 species of invertebrates. This biodiversity in the Amazonian rainforest is extremely rich. Scientists estimate that at least 2 million insect species are waiting to be discovered and named itself in the Amazonian forest. Now, we also learned that tropics harbor more biodiversity as compared to the temperate regions. What is the reason behind this? Number one, Temperate regions were subject to frequent glaciation, whereas tropics have remained relatively undisturbed for millions of years and thus have a long evolutionary time for species diversification. That is, when we again look back at the evolutionary sense, we see that the temperate regions were more under the frequent glaciation period and the tropics were undisturbed, and so they got more time for the evolution of species. So, the process of speciation initiated earlier as compared to the temperate regions in the tropical regions, and that is why we see that more number of biodiversity or more number of species has accumulated in the tropics. Secondly, the tropical environments are less seasonal, they are relatively more constant and predictable. So, since there are less fluctuation in the seasons, they are more constant and their environment is more so predictable, and such constant environment promote niche specialization. Now, the term which comes here is niche specialization. What do you mean by niche specialization? Niche specialization or ecological niche is actually the summary of the conditions and resources available for a species to increase its population. So, it is a summary of the conditions and resources available for a species to increase its population. And niche specialization means if an organism has been provided with ample resources and conditions to acquire it in the form of a habitat, as well as it has a certain role and function to perform in that particular habitat, that is known as an ecological niche. So, such niche specialization was possible in tropics because of constant and predictable seasons and the environmental conditions. Thirdly, there is more solar energy in the tropics. Being closer to the equator, the sun's rays fall directly on it, and more solar energy contributes to higher productivity, and which in turn leads to greater diversity. Productivity again is the rate of biomass production. If there will be more sunlight, there will be more primary productivity among the plants, there will be more photosynthesis, and if there will be more photosynthesis, more amount of biomass will be available for the next trophic level. So, these are the reasons why the tropics are more biodiverse as compared to the temperate region. Number 1, tropical regions, they got more time as they were not subjected to glaciation, and so the process of speciation or evolution started much earlier as compared to the temperate areas. Second, the tropics are less seasonal, they show less fluctuation in season, they are more constant and predictable, and that is why they allowed niche specialization, and therefore, there is more number of species in tropics. Thirdly, the solar energy which falls directly on these areas has contributed to more productivity, more primary productivity, leading to more biomass production and more efficiency. Next, we will move on to an important topic, which is species area relationship. Species area relationship. The species area relationship was given by a German naturalist and geographer, Alexander von Humboldt. And he said that as the area increases, the species richness also increases up to a certain extent. For this, he plotted a graph like this. On x axis we take area and on y axis we take species richness. So, it is a relationship of species richness with area. If we take a straight line log scale, and we plot a curve, we get a curve like this, which is known as rectangular hyperbola. Rectangular hyperbola. The curve which is obtained is a rectangular hyperbola. That is, as the area increases, the species richness is also increasing, but up to a certain extent, then it stops. This can be represented with the help of an equation, which is S is equal to C A to the power Z. Taking log on both sides, we can write it as log S is equal to log C plus Z log A, where S represents species richness, C is the y intercept, Z is the slope or regression coefficient, and A is the area. So, this kind of graph is obtained when we plot a graph between the area and species richness. Many ecologists, they have found that the value of Z is 0.1 to 0.2 irrespective of the taxonomic groups, irrespective of the region. But for a very large area like a big continent, it has been found to be 0.6 to 1.2. So, what is Z? Z is the slope, and the steepness of the slope represents the species richness. More steeper the slope, more will be the species richness. So, let us again see with the help of this slide. Alexander von Humboldt, a German naturalist and geographer, observed that within a region species richness increased with increasing explored area, but only up to a limit. This is the figure which has been given in your NCERT book. Area is represented on the x axis, species richness on the y axis. With reference to the log scale, if we plot a curve, we will get a rectangular hyperbola, and the equation is S is equal to C A to the power Z, which on applying log becomes log S is equal to log C plus Z log A. Using this equation, the ecologist, they can determine the slope or the species richness. By determining the slope, they can find out the species richness of a particular area. The value of Z generally lies in between 0.1 to 0.2, except very large areas where it can be much steeper and have values of 0.6 to 1.2. So, next moving on to a very important topic is importance of species diversity. We are talking so much about species, there are so many different types of species. We have realized that these species emerged on the earth by the process, by a gradual process of evolution. But what is the importance of these species? Are they really important for us? Does the number of a species in a community really matter to the functioning of the ecosystem? Many ecologists believe that communities with more species generally tend to be more stable than those with less species. Although there is no precise answer to these questions, like what is the importance of species, what will happen if few species are removed from ecosystem, will it matter for the well-being of the ecosystem? Although these have not been answered, such naive questions have not been answered precisely or accurately, but we can have a perspective on this. Many ecologists, they have believed, and there have been certain experiments to prove that more is the biodiversity of a region, more will be the more good will be the health of an ecosystem. So, what exactly is the stability for a biological community? We are talking about stability, that if there is more biodiversity, it will be more stable. what is referred by the stability of a community? Number 1, it should not show too much variation in productivity from year to year. For being stable, the first criteria is that it should show a constant productivity from year to year. Again, coming back to productivity, productivity is the rate of biomass production at each level. There are two types of productivity: primary productivity, which is related to the production of biomass in plants, and secondary productivity is related to the next trophic level, the animals. Next, it must be either resistant or resilient to occasional disturbances. There may be occasional disturbances. These may be because of natural disturbances or man-made disturbances, but the community should show resistance or resilience toward these occasional disturbances. Thirdly, it also must be resistant to invasion of alien species. If certain alien or species from a different ecosystem are brought into a particular ecosystem, it should be able to compete with it and it should be in a position to flourish. So, these are the features of a stable community, and ecologists believe that these three features are shown by a stable community, and these features are again enhanced if there is more number of biodiversity. So, we have studied about biodiversity, that there are three levels of biodiversity: genetic, species and ecological biodiversity. Obviously, if there is more biodiversity, it means that there are chances of more number of species and genetic diversity in it, which will finally contribute in making a community more stable. And this has also been proved by David Tillman's experiment. David Tillman did long term ecosystem experiment using outdoor plants. These throw some light on how these attributes are linked to species richness in a community. He found that plots with more species showed less year to year variation in total biomass. So, he actually did experiments and he observed that the year to year variation in the total biomass production was less in such communities which had more species diversity. He also showed that in his experiments, increased diversity contributed to higher productivity. So, if there is more number of biomass production, it will lead to more productivity. So, again, after understanding these experiments, let us again come back to the importance of biodiversity. Rich biodiversity is not only essential for the health of an ecosystem because it is contributing to its stability, but it is also imperative for the very survival of the human race on this planet. We are also a part of the nature. We humans are also a part of this ecosystem, and if there is a disturbance or deterrence in the ecosystem, it will eventually come back to us. So, the biodiversity or the species diversity is also imperative or important. We cannot do without it. The survival of the human race is governed by the biodiversity. Now, we have started understanding this. Earlier, we did not understand its importance, but now we have started understanding by looking at the impact of biodiversity loss on the nature and environment. Biodiversity and its conservation has acquired international concern the world over, and every year there are international conventions which occur in order to discuss how to conserve this biodiversity. At a time when we are losing species at an alarming rate, one might ask, does it really matter to us if a few species become extinct? Again, this question keeps on coming to minds of some people, that does it really matter to us if a few species become extinct? Would Western Ghat ecosystem be less functional if one of its tree frog species is lost forever? To understand this, we can refer to the Rivet-Popper hypothesis. Rivet-Popper hypothesis will not directly answer this question, but it will again help in developing a perspective towards this question. Rivet-Popper hypothesis was given by Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford ecologist, and he used an analogy to describe how species affect the stability of an ecosystem. He compared the ecosystem with an aeroplane and said that in an aeroplane, all the parts of the aeroplane, the wings, the seat, the body, the engine, they are joined together using thousands of rivets. Rivets means the nuts and bolts which fixes them together. Similarly, in an ecosystem, the function of the ecosystem, which comprises of nutrient cycling, decomposition, productivity, energy flow, these all are governed or maintained with the help of the species. And removal of rivets might not affect flight safety initially, but as more and more rivets are removed, the plane becomes dangerously weak over a period of time. And the similar applies to our ecosystem also. If the species are being removed initially, it might not show any effect on the health of the ecosystem, but gradually if more and more species are disappearing, it will start showing its effect on the ecosystem. The ecosystem will become weak, its sustenance will come in danger. Again, one more thing is that which rivet is removed may also be critical. For example, if the rivet on wing is removed, it will hamper the flight safety to a larger extent as compared to the rivets of the seats or the window panes. Similarly, in an ecosystem, there are certain species which are known as keystone species. If they are removed from an ecosystem, they will cause a much deterrence or a much disadvantage to the health of an ecosystem, because many other species, their survival is dependent on these keystone species. So, this is giving us a perspective on how ecosystem is being damaged by the removal or the loss of this species. Lesser number of species which might not be very important for that ecosystem may not cause initially any effect on it, but gradually when more and more number of species are being lost from that ecosystem, it will start showing its impact. Similarly, even in the initial stages, if a keystone species is removed from an ecosystem, the effect might be much faster and much detrimental. So, a keystone species is a plant or animal that plays a unique and crucial role in the way an ecosystem functions. Survival of many other species depend on these keystone species. For example, corals in a coral reef system. In a coral reef system, corals are the main keystone species and they provide breeding habitats and shelter, food to many other organisms which are living in this marine habitat. So, if these corals are removed, this ecosystem will come to an end altogether. Now, let us summarize what we have studied till now in this part 1 of Biodiversity and Conservation chapter of class 12. Today, we have learned about the concept of biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the variety, variations, variability of living organisms present on earth. Biodiversity is actually a compressed term which has been formed by adding or joining up two terms, biological diversity, and this term was coined by Walter G. Rosen. The contribution of Edward Wilson, who did a lot to aware people about the biodiversity and its importance, cannot be undermined. We have discussed about the levels of biodiversity. We have discussed that there are three important levels of biodiversity: genetic biodiversity, species biodiversity and ecological biodiversity. And all these three diversities are intertwined with each other, they are interlinked and interdependent and is forming the composite biodiversity of earth. Then we made a total estimate of this species, identified and unidentified. IUCN has recorded more than 1.5 million species of plants and animals. These are under the category of identified, but the unidentified species are much more in number, and we follow Robert May's logical, precise and scientific estimate of about 7 to 8 million total species on this earth. Then we have discussed about the global biodiversity, in which we saw that more number of animals have been recorded as compared to the plants. Among animals also, insects are again more in number, and among plants we have seen that fungi and angiosperms, they have been properly described and recorded. We still do not have any estimate about the prokaryotes, because they are not culturable, and if we apply the biochemical or molecular techniques, their number will be in millions. Then we have looked into the Indian biodiversity, that India is fortunate to have a rich biodiversity, and that is why it is among the 17 mega diverse countries of the world. We have also learnt about the pattern of biodiversity. We have seen the latitudinal gradient. We have also seen the species area relationship given by Alexander van Humboldt, who gave a curve which shows that with increasing area there will be increase in species richness, but up to a certain extent. He has also given a mathematical equation. By following that equation, we can find out the slope, which will give us the measure of species richness. We have also learnt or tried to generate a perspective on importance of species diversity with the help of river popper hypothesis. Now, let us evaluate what we have learned till now. Number 1 question: how is the presently occurring species extinction different from the earlier mass extinction? Yes, you are right that the present species extinction is occurring at a very fast rate as compared to the earlier and natural mass extinction. Today, the rate is 1000 to 10,000 times more as compared to the earlier mass extinction, and this is also known as the 6th extinction crisis, which is guided by anthropogenic activities. Why are conventional methods not suitable for the assessment of biodiversity of bacteria? These bacteria being very minute, they have certain characteristics which make them unsuitable to be cultured under laboratory conditions. So, these cannot be studied, and if we apply the biochemical methods, again we will tend to calculate its number in millions. This has also given rise to a new branch of biology, which is known as metagenomics, where the researchers are trying to find out about the genomes of bacteria. Next, is it true that more solar energy available in the tropics? Yes, definitely it is true that more solar energy is available in the tropics, and this is evident when we see that as we move away from the tropics, the length of the day decreases and the length of night or the duration of the night increases. This shows that more solar energy, duration of solar exposure is more in the tropics as compared to the temperate and the polar regions. Next, how do scientists extrapolate the total number of species on Earth? I told you earlier that the total number of species on Earth cannot be estimated because it is a huge number, and it is physically impossible for us to verify each and every species. So, the species which have been exhaustively studied, like that of insects, their ratio in the temperate and tropical regions are determined, and then this is extrapolated to other groups, other taxonomic groups. What do you understand by a keystone species? A keystone species is a species which is very important for the functioning of an ecosystem, and the survival of other species depend on it, on the keystone species. With this, I am giving you certain questions to reflect over. Number 1, primary productivity varies from ecosystem to ecosystem. Explain. Find out what is a tree line. Can you give any one example based on your day-to-day observation showing how loss of one species may lead to extinction of another? And do you think that more biodiversity enhances the chances of a community to remain stable or resilient under changing environmental situations? How? With these questions, I am leaving you for the next session so that we can continue with it and discuss these questions. Till then, goodbye and have a nice day. Thank you.